Johann Sebastian Bach's 6 sonatas and partitas written for the unaccompanied violin have not only survived the centuries of time, but they have also, throughout that time, remained an indispensable part of a musician's repertoire. Of the said solos for violinists, Bach's son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, wrote, "One of the greatest violinists told me once, that he had seen nothing more perfect for learning to be a good violinist, and could suggest nothing better to any one eager to learn than the said violin solos without bass." Bach completed the sonatas in the year 1720, as he was working as Kapellmeister, or concertmaster, in Cöthen. In 1805, J. F. Reichardt, reviewing the first edition of the solo violin music, wrote that the pieces represent perhaps the greatest example in any art of the freedom and certainty with which a great master can move, even when he is in chains. "In chains" may be an adequate description for Bach's situation as he wrote the violin solos, for as all of Bach's compositions reflect great creativity, Bach's creative production was bound up by the external factors of his places of work and his employers. Such binding external factors were present in Bach's time as Kapellmeister in Cöthen, as he was employed by Prince Leopold, who, as a Calvinist, did not allow sacred music. Therefore, Bach had to dedicate himself to composing mostly secular instrumental music. Bach composed many chamber pieces during his time in Cöthen. However, many are counted among the large number of Bach's lost works. Grove Music asserts that many of Bach's chamber pieces have been lost, and that the greatest losses of such chamber music affects the Cöthen period. As such, one may consider the world fortunate to have the violin solos not counted among the lost. To push one step further, the world might be considered fortunate because even the original manuscript of the sonatas was not lost. This was almost not the case, seeing as Bach's handwritten autograph manuscript was actually only discovered in 1814. It was found in a pile of old papers, certain to have become used as wrappings in a butter shop. Now for the fun part, the analysis. Sonata No. 1 in G minor, Adagio. Bach's Adagio follows the typical sonata structure, being exposition, development, and recapitulation, or ternary form. However, this formatting may not be clearly evident when you first listen to it or when you first glance at the score. For example, let's listen to the first 2 measures of section A, where our theme is first introduced in the exposition, and then we'll compare it to where that same theme is then reintroduced in the recapitulation. Now let's listen to the first 2 measures of the recapitulation. Remember, this is the same theme. For those of you who might be a little confused as to why they sound so different, let us address the structure that Bach used to compose this piece. An important element to keep in mind as we approach this analysis is the time period in which Bach was writing. A characteristic element of Baroque music is the figured bass, in which a bass line is typically written into the music to provide frame and structure. As such, on the title page as well as at the beginning of each movement, Bach made sure to write "without bass," as a clear emphasis that the expected figured bass was not written into his piece. Although a figured bass line has not been written below the violin score, Bach did not disregard the idea of figured bass. In fact, the figured bass for this piece has been implied and mixed into the violin line, written usually as part of a chord, and still acts as a foundation upon which Bach built the entire movement. When we study this figured bass line, it is much easier to recognize the ternary form and other core structural elements of Bach's piece. Let's look at the same measures we just listened to written out with Bach's implied figured bass added beneath. If we take a careful look at the bass line, we notice that the recapitulation is written a fifth below the exposition. So instead of being written in G minor, the recapitulation has actually switched to C minor. This can be better seen when we write in the scale degrees of the figured bass in their proper keys. Once we can clearly see that the recapitulation has been written in the subdominant, the evidence is even strengthened when we see that the two sections follow the same chord progression. 1 to the diminished seventh in the first inversion, to the 5 to the 1. Another reason the theme is not as easily identified in these two sections is that rather than simply restating the theme by using the same melody, Bach elaborates and adds even more ornamentation to the original melody. As we continue to look closely at these measures, we begin to notice that the two sections really do follow similar rhythm patterns. Let us focus in on just the first measures of each section. Looking at the first two beats of the measure, we see the pattern of a long note succeeded by a run of 32nd and 64th notes. Beats 3 and 4 of the measures are nearly identical to one another. The major differences being that the chord as written in the exposition has been arpeggiated in the recapitulation. These kinds of striking similarities continue throughout the entire sections. The recapitulation really does show the same theme. It's just written a fifth below and has much more ornamentation and elaboration. Measures 9 to 13 constitute the development of the piece. They follow completely different figured bass and structure than that followed by the exposition and recapitulation. There are several key changes throughout this piece. The first key change occurs in the exposition, in measure 5, when the key switches from G minor to D minor. This key change is also reflected in the recapitulation, in measure 18, when the modulated theme switches from C minor to G minor. The other key changes in the piece surround the development. The development actually starts with a key change as the song is switching from D minor back to G minor. Then, in the last beat of measure 10, we can see a key change from G minor to C minor. Another key change follows in measure 13, when the piece switches to E minor. To conclude the development section of the piece, and to begin the theme again, this time in the recapitulation, the piece switches from E minor in measure 13 to C minor in measure 14. With the interesting rhythms and placement of chords throughout the piece, there are several interesting points. One climatic point in the piece would have to be in measures 12 to 13. In measure 12, everything is leading up to a very strong cadence. However, instead of hearing the expected resolution, Bach writes in a deceptive cadence going from a strong 7 in the modulated C minor key to a diminished third. There is a genius to the way that this piece, as well as the rest of the movements in the violin solo works, was written. It is a very technical piece that follows a specific structure. The improvisational elements of the piece allow the performer to interpret the piece in multiple ways, allowing a rich learning experience as well as listening experience. These elements combined most likely inspired Kirk McElhern, a modern-day music critic and author, to write, "Bach's sonatas are miracles of music, where a single violin embarks on some of the most remarkable musical discourse ever written. Thank you for listening to this screencast. That is my analysis of Bach's Sonata No. 1 in G minor, Adagio.